In thinking about the significance of On the Origin of Species, it's important to recognize that the work provides not just one idea, but a lot of important ideas for how we think about evolution. The 20th century biologist Ernst Mayr identified 5 separate revolutionary ideas that come out of Darwin's work. And it's amazing that going back and reading this book more than 150 years after its publication, it still provides valuable insights into how we think about evolution today. The 5 theories, or the 5 revolutionary ideas that Mayr identified in Darwin's work, include first and foremost the notion that evolution happens. The world changes, it's not a constant, and it changes according to systematic rules and practices. Now, this idea wasn't entirely revolutionary at the time. A number of authors had previously identified the notion of change in the natural world, but Darwin's idea was so well documented, so well described in On the Origin of Species, that very soon after its publication, the notion that evolution happens became widespread. The second idea that Darwin provides us with is the notion of common descent. The idea that humans are not the product of unique creation, but rather descend from a common ancestor, correctly identified by others in the 19th century as the African apes, and that because of this, humans are not at the center of the natural world. This was a radical shift in thinking about how the biological world is structured and what place humans occupy within that structure. Humans are not the center, we're just another creature that has been evolving over time. The third idea we can get from Darwin's work, and this was heavily influenced by his training in geology, is that evolution is a process that happens gradually. It takes a long time for evolutionary changes to accumulate and contribute to the origin of new species. Now, this is an idea that itself remains questionable and controversial to some academics, but it's certainly the case that many of the processes of evolution that we'll observe are processes that require a long amount of time to observe and behold. And that's a point we'll come back to in just a moment. The fourth idea that we get from Darwin's work is the notion that natural selection is the primary evolutionary force that shapes an organism's fit with its environment. Now, one of the things we think about when we think about Darwin and natural selection is the role his experience as a naturalist on the ship the Beagle had in shaping his views on this topic. When Darwin graduated from college, prepared to go on to a life in the ministry, he instead had the opportunity to spend 2 years as a naturalist on the Beagle. This took him around the world, and in the end the trip actually took 5 years. During this time, he had the opportunity to see geological formations and natural wildlife in a variety of different environments. And across these environments, he observed how different organisms, not only were they amazing in the kind of biological variation they displayed, but they fit their environment in a unique way that suggested a uniform process of change that had shaped these organisms to fit that environment, something that we think of today as adaptation. Now, it's interesting that Darwin's work actually was heavily influenced by not just his voyage on the Beagle, but his subsequent life and his examinations of not natural selection, but artificial selection, as practiced by English farmers and pigeon breeders. The final idea we can get from Darwin's book is the notion that evolution is a population process. New species emerge not because a single individual emerges with new differences and new changes, but rather populations change over time. So the focus and the shift to populations as the primary unit of evolutionary change was critical and vital for the development of 20th century understandings of evolutionary sciences. In the course materials that follow this lecture, you'll find a link to a complete online edition of On the Origin of Species, well worth your time to check out. And if you do check out that edition, you'll see that in the entirety of On the Origin of Species, there's just one single illustration, seen here. Now, this illustration is what we would think of as a phylogeny today, or a hypothesis of evolutionary relationships. But it also highlights some of Darwin's key ideas. Looking at the illustration along the bottom, there are a set number of species in the past, and there are species in the present, and then connections between them. We see in this process change through time, some lineages changing a great deal over time, other lineages not changing very much at all. We see the origin of new species, we see the extinction of species in the past, and we also see that variation at any given time point is very important to Darwin's thinking. So although simple, this illustration reveals a lot of Darwin's ideas.